Greetings to you all who have joined us for this 10th SAPES Trust Policy Dialogue Forum on Zoom and on Facebook across Zimbabwe, across the region, the continent, and out there in Europe and Americas, in Australasia. We have been at it for a couple of months, 3 or 4 months now, and our focus has been this crisis in Zimbabwe and the various ways we can assist towards its resolution. Tonight, we are looking at the scourge of state-sponsored abductions, arbitrary arrests, torture, and violence in Zimbabwe, with the focus on how to stop it now. I want to begin by thanking Eleanor Sisulu for suggesting this subject during the last conversation 2 weeks ago. And I'm glad she's joining us in this conversation. Second, I'd like to thank Tony Rila, my co-convener on the platform for concerned citizens, but for thanking him for the concept note which you have, which puts everything in perspective, but also thank him for putting together a very exciting team, which I will introduce shortly, but here just to mention them. Tony Rila himself, Musa Kika, Director of the Human Rights NGO Forum, Muleya Nanyanda from Amnesty International. She has been on this program with us before, so likewise Musa Kika. And a special welcome to Lisa Henry, Secretary General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims. Welcome, Lisa. Then Paul Graham, former Director of EDASA and Freedom House. We had to apologize to Paul. Paul, the designer, had put P.W. Botha as his photograph in the first version. And that's why he got it very wrong. But that's Paul Graham. We will see him shortly. Last but not least, Sipho Malunga, whom I call him Sydney after his father, a great hero of a man. Sipho is equally doing a very good job, not only as Executive Director of CISA, but also as a regular participant in this Policy Dialogue Forum. So what I intend doing after my introduction is to introduce them formally, and they will give a minute or two being a summary of what they intend stating before us. And I will also likewise introduce the discussants. The concept note is self-explanatory, but just want to emphasize 3 points. The first is that the scourge of abductions, arbitrary arrests, torture, violence in Zimbabwe is very unusual. Unusual because it's only in Zimbabwe where such is happening in the region. And that explains the nature of the state in Zimbabwe. It's a state under siege, a state alienated from its people, and therefore has to indulge in these nefarious acts, partly to preempt the population from doing what is obvious, even demonstrations. It is a state which, as can be seen, is forced to depend on this brute force to try and silence the people. And therefore, abductions, arbitrary arrests, and violence in general are not an end in themselves. They have a purpose. They are meant to preempt opposition. They're meant to instill fear, to silence the population. And as we know from history, this is unsustainable and therefore indicate the inevitable end of such a system, as history would inform us. And yet this can continue indefinitely with increased violence, more and more abductions, as the state becomes more and more desperate, more and more alienated from the people. So in the meantime, how to stop it? The pressure such as this kind of discussion, the pressure which has been exerted and asserted by the media in the last few months, at home, in the South African media, especially the electronic media, SABC, ENCA, the media abroad, and the various interventions, at least in the form of statements from the AU, South Africa itself, which has been forced or compelled by its own media and the graphic illustrations of the abuse of human rights, to make 2 visits to Zimbabwe and to engage the Zimbabwean government in the first instance to try and stop these abuse of human rights. And more recently, the African Commission on Human Rights at his meeting in Gambia recently spoke about the situation in Zimbabwe. So we will look at how we can sustain pressure by exposing the rot and even identifying the individual perpetrators. We'll want to make concert or appeal to those in the state that have a conscience, and there are many who are appalled by this. They might be part of the state, but clearly the state is not homogeneous. We know that. And I know people, even ministers, army generals, were appalled by this. How can we make concert with them to see how we can stop this? Of course, international action, such as represented by people who have on this platform, on the panel and among the discussants. And above all, which has been the theme, the constant theme of these discussions, is the pursuit of a solution for Zimbabwe. We believe as historians that we are approaching a situation where it will become inevitable, necessary, and urgent to begin discussing and coming to some solution in Zimbabwe. So we'll start now with Tony Rila, a platform for concerned citizens, a key factor in this conversation, sometimes in the background, sometimes as he is today in the front line. Tony, a minute.
Thank you, Ibo, and good evening to everyone and to my colleagues. I want to make very quickly a number of points. I'm just going to outline what I'm going to talk about in slightly more detail. I want to raise the notion that the violence today is part of continuous cycles of organized violence and torture in this country. I want to raise the issues that are related to both formal and informal impunity. Impunity is a very serious problem that we deal with. I want to talk briefly about the legacy of organized violence and torture. What are the consequences for the victims and the survivors? I'll talk briefly also about how this has led to the destruction of social capital and political trust in Zimbabwe, something that Ibo has already alluded to. And I want to raise the issue that actually things are getting worse and not better. And in conclusion, I want to talk about what should be done now. These are the points that I would like to cover in slightly more detail just now. Thank you, Ibo.
Thanks, Tony. Musa Kika. Musa. Okay. Welcome,
Okay.
Musa, speaker from the
Thank you.
NGO Forum.
I couldn't unmute myself. But thanks, Ibo, for putting together this timely conversation. So I'm going to follow Tony, and I'm going to touch briefly on the issue of the prevalence of torture and organized violence in Zimbabwe. I'm going to try and give a little bit of statistics so that we can paint a picture of where we are right now while Tony takes it from the historical perspective. I'm going to reflect on the response of the state, the attempt to silence the victims of organized violence and torture. I'll also talk about government's refusal to be held accountable in any manner or form. And I will stress on the issue of citizen agency, as well as both the legal and constitutional aspects as ways through which we can address torture. I do believe strongly that as long as we have a group of people in charge that are not constitutionalists, it's difficult to address torture just purely from the legal side of things. You need citizen agency, you need other forms of intervention. So what that kind of citizen agency is a conversation that we must have. So I'll touch a little bit on that as well as the discussion progresses. Thanks.
Thanks, Musa. Thanks very much. Mleya.
Thank you very much.
Mleya is no newcomer here. We've been working with her for many years, and we've met in many fora. We're meeting again next week, and
yes.
Of course, she's appropriately here on such a discussion, such as we're having today, coming as she does from Amnesty International. So, Mleya, what are you going to tell us?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an honor to be amongst everyone, and thank you very much for having me. So there's just a lot to talk about on Zimbabwe, but I will touch a little bit about the historic work that Amnesty has done on Zimbabwe. My major thrust is to really talk about issues around accountability. And so I'll touch very, very lightly on some of the work that we've done in the past. I will not really talk about the work we're doing now because there's just a lot happening. And then I want to talk again quite briefly around international crimes. And lastly, I would like to talk about what I think could probably be some of the things we can do to bring about accountability. So that's what I want to focus on.
Thanks, Mleya. Thank you very much. Let me introduce our discussants. Lisa first, Lisa Henry. Just talk briefly about what you do.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here and an honor. I'm the Secretary General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims. And I'll be talking tonight about the international parameters and the international human rights treaties. So the system that we actually have, whether it's being used or not, but the system we have and what we can do about implementing and using some of that system and using some of the member centers and the inputs that come from them to actually provide a policy framework as we move into this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you very much. Paul Graham.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. I am the former regional project director for Freedom House Southern Africa. And I understand my mandate to reflect on our presenters and to reflect on ways in which perhaps particularly civil society and civic agency may be empowered. But I'm looking forward to hearing the inputs so that we can deal with this complicated matter.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. You can see it's not PW bother. Sydney, which I mean Sipo.
Thank you so much, Doc. And thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm a discussant rather in this particular conversation. So my preoccupation is how to hold perpetrators accountable. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So we all can relate and identify and document the violations, and we can say they've been going on for years. What I want to discuss is the prospects of accountability and what are the opportunities and the mechanisms that are out there, so that people have a sense of whether there's any prospect of accountability and justice for past, current, and what we assume is going to be future crimes. Thank you.
Thanks, Sydney. I'm now going to ask Tony to start, and the panelists 7 minutes each, the discussants 5 minutes each. You want to also explain that, please put up your hand if you want to contribute after the panelists have said their bit. As I said earlier on, in deference to Eleanor, who brought us here for this discussion, should be the first after the panelists, after the discussants, I mean. So back to Tony. Tony Rila, your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ibo. You know, I think it's absolutely shameful that we can be here in 2020, 40 years after independence, and that we are still discussing organized violence and torture. And by the way, that term was coined here in Harare in 1990 in a very large conference to which IRCT and Amnesty and many others were party, where we talked about the differences of the violence that we saw in Southern Africa during the struggle for freedom. And we realized in that term that torture was a serious problem, but it fitted within the region in a whole range of other things, forced displacements, apartheid, et cetera, et cetera. So we coined a different term in 1990. And it's important to realize that that's now 30 years ago or more, that this country embraced the notion that organized violence and torture was anathema to the Southern African region. So it is absolutely shameful that we're still talking about it today. The point is that unless we deal with it, what we see is that these cycles of organized violence and torture persist over time. And they have done in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has a really unhappy history of organized violence and torture. We tend to think about the organized violence and torture from 1980, but we must not forget the Liberation War and the organized violence and torture that took place there. Now, I'm raising this notion of cycles because these cycles are identified by mass violence followed by impunity. And this was begun before Zimbabwe became a state. Under the Smith regime in 1975, they passed a law called the Indemnity and Compensation Act, which essentially was proactive impunity for any violation committed by a state agent. And that's very serious. What you're saying ahead of time is that if you do unacceptable things, you are excused. And mass violence was continued and was ended in Lancaster House, but it was followed immediately by 2 amnesties in 1979 under the British government and in 1980 by the Zimbabwean government. We then went through another process in the 80s of mass violence, followed by amnesty. And we followed to a lesser extent since 2000, and certainly the 2000 election, there was an attempt at amnesty. So what we see is that Zimbabwe has this history of periods of mass violence. And we could add into this period of mass violence the absolutely violent elections in 2002 and 2008. And I want to point out, that one of the things we do in Zimbabwe is we forget our history. We are very focused on 2008, but those of us who witnessed 2002 will know that that was a brutal election, because it was not just around the immediate election, it began in the year 2000 in all the by-elections. So there's been this sustained use of violence. So what we see in Zimbabwe in particular is this relationship between mass violence and then impunity. Now, I want to distinguish two different kinds of impunity here, because gross human rights violations have increasingly become unacceptable in the world. With the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Tribunals, people do not accept this. We're having conflicts about Myanmar now. So formal impunities are seriously problematic. So the kind of amnesties and pardons and these sorts of things are no longer acceptable. What we have seen in Zimbabwe is the replacement of formal impunity with what I would call practical impunity. That in this organized violence and torture that takes place, what we see is that the victims are all too frequently arrested themselves on spurious charges and then tied up themselves in lengthy remand proceedings, court proceedings, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, the charges against them are dismissed, no investigation happens to the perpetrators, and the only redress that the victim has is to resort to civil litigation. And civil litigation is costly and lengthy, and organizations like Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights and the Forum and others, excuse me, have all resorted to litigation. And what is important about that litigation, it has established that gross human rights violations have actually taken place. The Forum has a very important report that shows that when you go to court, the courts give damages to the victims on the basis that their gross human rights violations have been perpetrated. But it's also important to think in this historical perspective about the legacy of organized violence and torture. And it is very important that we have to see that what we carry in Zimbabwe is the legacy of victims from every decade, the decade before and the decades before independence, and every decade since independence, perhaps less in the 1990s. And what has also happened is that in none of this period has there ever been a formal system of assistance to the victims. That was not present for the victims of the Liberation War. I know this because the organization I was part of at the time, the Imani Trust, we were staggered to find people 2 decades after the Liberation War who had not been recognized as victims of organized torture and received the kind of therapy, physiotherapy, et cetera, that they should have done. And the point about not providing this kind of assistance to victims, and particularly since 2000, it represents another form of impunity, because if the victims are not assisted, their stories will not be told, and therefore nobody will be embarrassed by it. And we have to remember that the major consequence of organized violence and torture is psychological disorder. It's not just the bruised bodies, it's the disability, psychological disability that people live with for decades afterwards. What it also does, all of this violence over time, it destroys both social capital and political trust in a very serious way in the state. Now, it's in political science, it's very clear that states that fail to deliver public goods and services lose the trust of their citizens. I think that's manifest in Zimbabwe. Citizens have failed by the state and live in really parlous circumstances. And states that then deal with that lack of trust and resort to coercion increase that political mistrust. And Zimbabwe currently exemplifies this extensive use of coercion, the failure to deliver public goods and services, and the consequences that the citizenry have lost all political trust in the government and the state. I'm saying this because currently one of the stories that is put out there to deal with this legacy is that we must have reconciliation. You can have reconciliation if people trust the state, okay? But if you do not have that, and the social capital of it is broken in the ways that it is, and the political trust is damaged as far as it is, these are pious calls for something that just cannot happen. The consequence of all of this, failure to deliver goods, the coercion that's used, has made Zimbabwe the most politically polarized country out of 31 African states. And the point now is that was the case 18 months ago at that election. That was the comment made by an analysis done by the Afrobarometer, that Zimbabwe is the most polarized country. The social capital and the political trust in this country is gone. And since that time, what has happened is things have got worse, not better. There are more violations since the coup than in the period from 2013 to November 2017. They've increased. We see that the military are much more involved in violations than any other time since 2000. If you look at the human rights reports, you will see that the military have a very low presence until about 2008, but since 2017, they're very high profile in the perpetration of gross human rights violations. And very seriously, and Ibo referred to this in the beginning, is abductions have increased significantly. Abductions are not hugely common in Zimbabwe. They have now become common and very serious. So, what should be done? In all of this history, I'm painting a picture of a country that has repetitive cycles of gross human rights violations. And this is not recognized sufficiently by anyone. It is critical that all states right now recognize that there is serious political violence and not sweeping it under the carpet as was done in 2002 or 2008 or 2018. In 2008, the South African government sent 2 respected jurists here to investigate the gross human rights violations. The South African government suppressed those reports for nearly a decade. In 2008, they sent 2 generals here. Nobody has ever seen that report. And in 2018, we have a report, the Motlanthe Commission, about the violence that happened in 2018. Not one single recommendation has really been implemented. And where does this lead us to? I'm going to pick up on a point that was raised in 2005 by Anna Tibajauka, investigating Operation Murambachina. She made the comment in all her analysis, and she made 2 comments about what needed to be done as a consequence. The first one she raised was that the situation in Zimbabwe evoked the responsibility to protect, a non-binding convention that was signed by every single member state of the United Nations in 2005. And she said, this is a case where the responsibility to protect should be evoked. She also raised the issue that had actually, Murambachina had constituted crimes against humanity. Not strongly, but I will say that serious lawyers like the Oxford Pro Bono Publico unit did an analysis, and they did agree that these were crimes against humanity. And my colleague Musa may talk about a report, a recent report of the Forum, where they alleged that crimes against humanity had been committed. And certainly this could be raised very strongly in respect of Kukurakundi. But the point about the responsibility to protect, and I want to quote the significant section here, is that each individual state has the responsibility to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. This responsibility entails the prevention of such crimes, including the incitement through appropriate and necessary means. What they meant by that was that other states have a responsibility to take this seriously. When a country is unable to either look after its citizens or is actually making them unwell by various means, this is a responsibility for every country. And so that means intervening early and heeding the warning signs. And what this means is that R2P, as they call it, the responsibility to protect, means that you challenge sovereignty. That's what has to happen in Zimbabwe. The region doesn't sweep things under the carpet. It recognizes that inherently Zimbabwe is a violent state with governments pre and post independence who have no compunction but to use violence and then to find ways of impunity to cover that up. And that means you have to interfere. And my point is that good neighbors do interfere, just like good neighbors interfere in abusive families with domestic abuse or child abuse. When countries are being abused, then it is the responsibility to protect the citizens. So what do you do now? You take the violence seriously and you don't sweep it under the carpet, but you act. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. That's very good. You gave us a good historical perspective, and the common denominator, the last 60, 70 years in Zimbabwe, has been the feature of states under siege. The Rhodesian state, now the Zimbabwean state. And one of the common things for those of us who have witnessed the violence of the colonial era and tasted some of it in the post-independence era, is the common denominator with respect to the Law and Order Maintenance Act under the Rhodesian regime. It was there, we were detained, no trial, indefinitely, and many of us perished thereby. The reason that we don't have the Law and Order Maintenance Act in Zimbabwe, but the effect is the same. The manner in which abductions are taking place, the arbitrary arrests. So one can see a constant theme in our country. Let me now turn to Musa Kika. Musa.
Thank you, Ibo, and thanks to Tony before me. I think Tony set us on a good path by providing us context. Now, the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum has now and again reported, report after another, widespread cases of torture and abductions. And I'm going to try and reflect in my talk some of these reports and what we document, just to paint a picture of what's happening now. What you notice is that what has been happening in the colonial times, coming into early independence and now, the conversations remain the same regarding these violations happening. What's worse, some of these violations are even worse now, like abductions. We are at an all-time high with abductions since independence now. So in June 2020, the forum released a report that we titled Guns Run Amok, where we were looking at extrajudicial killings, assault, and torture, particularly around the August 2018 period and also the January 2019 period. The report does identify actually systemic and widespread violation of rights, to such an extent that we suggest that because of the widespread and systemic nature of the violations, crimes against humanity are in fact being committed. Again, in June 2020, we released a report that is called Root by Violence, where we were documenting patterns of politically motivated violence. And we looked at the periods 1998 to 2019. And again, cases like torture, rape, abductions are seen high up there when it comes to politically motivated violence. But what is quite chilling is that abductions have in fact been on the rise since November 2017. Tony made a point about this. All the 20 members of the forum recorded the following abductions. 2018, we had 24 abductions. In 2019, we had 67 abductions. That's a massive jump. In 2020, so far, as of October, we have 15 abductions. 11 of them are tied to the July 31st protest. And this brings the total number of abductions since the new government came into place to 106. And you have about 25 extrajudicial killings added to that as well. Now, these violations have been noted by the international community, by regional neighbors, South Africa, by the UN. Tony referred to the statements that were released by various bodies. For instance, the UN human rights experts on 10 June released a statement to the effect that Zimbabwe should immediately end the reported pattern of disappearances and torture that are aimed at suppressing protesters and also dissent. Similarly, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights released a statement on 24 July 2020. We saw on 7 August 2020, the chairperson of the African Union Commission also calling upon Zimbabwe to stop its pattern of human rights abuses. And when the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association came to Zimbabwe in 2019, he concluded that there is, in fact, a serious deterioration of the political, economic, and social environment in Zimbabwe since August 2018. So that's the trajectory that we essentially are in. And in 2019, the forum also released another report called The New Deception, What Has Changed, in which we actually show that the record of the new dispensation in upholding human rights, contrary to the government's own rhetoric, is in fact a downgrade from the days of Robert Mugabe. And successive reports actually indicate that. Of course, the government has been rubbishing these figures. The government has been rubbishing the evidence of abductions and torture. And in the government's books, there is probably no one who has been abducted in its tenure. Not a single soul has been prosecuted in Zimbabwe for abductions. What we have been seeing in the past few months is a change in tact in the manner in which the government is responding to organized violence and torture. So our government used to attribute abductions to what they termed an invisible third force. But perhaps out of realization that third force or not, the government remains obligated to protect the life and security of its citizens. The government then changed tact, and now they say abductions are stage managed. They are fake, meant to attract attention. So you then see government functionaries and even ruling party functionaries making statements to this effect, that abductions are fake, even before investigations are done in particular cases. You had Patrick Chinamasa saying that in the case of Joanna Mamombe and the 2 MDC ladies. You had the Minister of Home Affairs also saying the same. You have the Information Secretary saying the same. Essentially, rubbishing claims of victims who are coming forward to say, we have been abducted and tortured. And the case of Joanna Mamombe and the 2 other MDC ladies is also indicative of a new pattern where we are seeing criminalization of victims who come forward and report abductions. So they come and report, but they become the ones to be arrested because they are supposedly faking their abductions. And the goal in that is to try and ensure that no one comes forward to say, I was abducted and tortured. Because there is now fear that if you do that, you are actually the one who will be arrested and tried. So that feeds then into the impunity that Tony ably covered. And when it comes to impunity, this again is well documented. We released a report in 2019 called Justice Under Siege, in which we were looking at the subversion of due process in the criminal courts where state-sponsored organized violence and torture is concerned. In another report that we titled Anti-Impunity Report 2019, we documented impunity by design, where a string of clemency orders and presidential pardons are issued after episodes of state-sponsored or politically motivated organized violence and torture. We have seen this successively after election periods, where in Zimbabwe, the graph of organized violence and torture spikes. But then even in those cases where the state actually admits that someone has been abducted, we have seen no prosecutions. This is the case with Justina Mukoko, where the state admitted in court that yes, the individual was abducted and tortured and paid damages, but still no one has been prosecuted. The case of Itai Dzamara is another case in point. The car that was used was identified and the owner was tracked, but nothing has been done. And recently, the case of Tawanda Mucheyua as well, where Impala Car Rentals was implicated, but nothing has been done to track who hired that vehicle that was used in committing the offense. Now, all this inaction tends to suggest that those who investigate or those who are empowered to order investigations are in fact complicit. They are in fact implicated in this. It's a natural conclusion to draw when you see inaction, even when there is some form of evidence. Now, our government has consistently refused to be held accountable. The government looks down upon its courts. but also the regional and international mechanisms that are there to hold us accountable, they have been shunned. The government has up to now refused or neglected to sign up to the Convention Against Torture, as well as the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. The government has not signed up to the African Court on Human and People's Rights. The government has not signed up to the Rome Statute, which establishes the International Criminal Court. And many of us on this call would recall that it was in fact the government of Zimbabwe in 2010, which led to the dissolution of the SADC tribunal when a number of cases were decided against Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe lobbied SADC to dissolve that, and it was in fact dissolved, and now we have the SADC Administrative Tribunal with curtailed jurisdiction. So what this trajectory shows us is a government that doesn't want to be held to account. Instead, what we are seeing is the government having interest in ensuring that people don't talk about abductions and people don't report. So we have seen incidences where there is muzzling of anyone who seeks to talk about abductions. And I'll give a case in point. On 25 June this year, 2020, it was a day before the International Day in Support of Victims of Torture, when the forum brought together a number of torture victims and civil society personnel to discuss torture on national radio. And this was Capital FM, a state-owned station which is owned by Zim Papers. Our program was terminated mid-air because the powers that be did not like the content of that program. When we later engaged the authorities, we were told that it's because the government was not there to defend itself. And of course, this shook us because we couldn't understand why it is that the government needed to come to defend itself on a program where victims are narrating their ordeal. We are talking about torture and abductions, which are recognized criminal offenses at international law. So why would the government want to come and defend itself? Of course, perpetrators are always scared of exposure and accountability. So what must be done? This is the picture, this is the trajectory. What must be done? I suggest that it is important to ensure that whilst we are pushing for the legal and constitutional framework to be operationalized and the international accountability mechanisms to be used, citizen agency should be at the fore of these processes. I say so because when you have a system where you have people who are in charge and they are not constitutionalists, they don't care about rule of law, they don't care about accountability, it is important for citizens to invoke their power. In terms of our constitution, all power is vested in the people. Executive power, judicial, the judicial power, executive power, all that power is vested in the people. Now it is important for people to be able to shape the kind of system and the kind of society that they need. So I'm going to suggest a few action points. Number one, documenting. It is extremely important for citizens to organize themselves and document evidence and patterns of abductions and torture and any form of organized violence. Zimbabwe is not a post-conflict state, it is a state in conflict. So these violations that we see happening now will actually form part of the broader transitional justice issues that we have to address now, but also in a post-conflict state if we are to get there. That evidence is key. And in the case of Zimbabwe, our crimes don't prescribe for at least 20 years. But even if we are not to get accountability in the long run in the local courts, we do hope that the regional and international platforms will someday find efficacy over the Zimbabwean situation. So we must document, we must place things on record. Number two, I suggest strengthening accountability institutions and demanding effectiveness. A lot of what we have with our institutions is performing democracy, as opposed to real substantive democracy. So you have institutions that are created by the Constitution, but that in fact do not serve their purpose per their constitutional mandate. So that we must push back. And we must ensure that institutions like the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, the courts, the National Prosecuting Authority, live up to their constitutional expectations. We have in our constitution a mechanism that is provided under Section 210, the independent mechanism to deal with security sector human rights violations. Last month, we had a Constitutional Court judgment, in fact, sometime early this month, which said that institution should be set up. It's unacceptable 7 years down the line since adoption of the new constitution for that institution not to be there. So we must demand that institutions like that are put in place. We hear that the government is planning to subsume this institution under the proposed Public Protector's Office, covered under the current proposed amendments to the Constitution. But we know that that would eventually lead to an institution that is not independent and that will not be able to discharge its constitutional mandate. So those are the kind of attempts by government that we must strongly push back on. And then number 3, I suggest pushing for regional and international accountability. And I'm glad Tony touched on this when he spoke about the responsibility to protect. So groups that are fighting for accountability, citizens should push for use of extraterritorial jurisdiction to prosecute perpetrators wherever possible. Of course, this then presupposes sufficient documentation of admissible evidence, but also a sense of peer accountability among nations in the region and beyond. This is a whole big topic of fellow countries, fellow SADC countries, and even African countries failing to hold each other to account. But it's not a lost cause, it's a frontier that must be advanced. And then number 4, exposing and continuing to speak about it. We must expose perpetrators and those implicated, expose the tactics, expose the trends, and remain vigilant. We can't be silenced. We need to continuously talk about it. And then citizen agency. Because of the system that we have, it is very difficult to simply rely on the legal mechanisms that are there without having people agitate, for the duty bearers to be accountable and for those frameworks to actually be utilized. So the people should ensure that those institutions do their work. Nowadays with technology, the people should use the devices that they have and the mechanisms that are there to record violations, expose perpetrators, collect information, piece that information together. And there must always be an economic and a political cost to human rights violations. The individuals that perpetrate, some of them are known, some of them have been exposed. The businesses that are implicated, some of them are known. A lot of these perpetrators run businesses. Those businesses can be known. I believe it is time for citizens to mount their own sanctions against such individuals and establishments. Shun business with them, shun association with them, etc., etc. That brings an economic cost to things. When our radio program at the forum was terminated in June, we took the decision that we are not going to fund oppression by engaging those businesses. So we have stopped using those kind of businesses. And we think if that kind of action were to happen at a large scale, we are going to bring an economic cost to oppression. And I'll end, Ibo, by saying the following. In an autocratic system, no one is safe. Those in power may think they are safe, but they are not. So even those who create the autocracy are not safe. Those who are sent to abduct people are not safe. Those who send abductors are themselves not safe. It's a cycle, as Tony puts it. It comes to haunt the creator. And William Shakespeare in Macbeth puts it as follows. He says, blood instructions, which being taught, return to plague the inventor. So it's a cycle that unless we break, is going to continuously hit us. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Very poignant presentation, Musa. I'm glad that you really, the NGO forum of which you are director is documenting. I've always been worried about the documentation, and I'm glad to know and hear today that these are being documented. And really you followed on very well from Tony, who gave a historical perspective to focus on the current. And for those, and I hope they're out there, people in denialism, you'll have heard from Musa, abductions have been taking place. Over 100 abductions in the period since 2017. they are reality. Yes, we couldn't bring some of the victims of these abductions and torture before this program for various reasons. But I think the account given by Musa is so poignant. It brings the reality of what we're talking about home. If anyone had a doubt at all, here it is. Thanks very much. Let's move to Leah.
Thank you very much, Doc. Yes, so yeah, listening to Tony and Musa, one just can't help but think what else can be done in Zimbabwe. As I mentioned at the beginning, Amnesty has been working on Zimbabwe for a very long time. First, when it was still Southern Rhodesia, when most of us probably were not even born. And then from the 1980s, when it became independent. So as Amnesty, we've always been concerned with issues around accountability and have produced many reports over the years on Zimbabwe. In fact, there's almost always one output or other on Zimbabwe from Amnesty International every month. If you go to our pages, you will find so much on Zimbabwe in terms of documentation and evidence that we have stored in our evidence lab. On numerous occasions, we've called on authorities to release political detainees, often arrested on trumped-up charges. We've also asked authorities to investigate all allegations of torture by state security agents. We've documented many enforced disappearances. Musa was talking about some of them here. There are so many. Torture and extrajudicial executions among a slew of other nefarious activities. So on 23rd May, 1997, Pierre Sane, who was then the Secretary General of Amnesty International, wrote a letter to then President Robert Mugabe, who was assuming the chairmanship of the Organization of African Unity, the forerunner to the African Union, for those of you who were not yet born when the AU was a thing. In the letter, he asked Mugabe to commit himself and his government to resolving Zimbabwe's need for greater openness and a public discussion of the massive human rights violations that took place in Matabeleland and the Midlands in the 1980s. In 1983, Mugabe, as we all know, appointed Judge Simplicius Chihambakwe to chair a commission to investigate the killing of political dissidents and other civilians in the Matabeleland region, as well as to gather testimony from villagers about what occurred. This was the Kukurakundi Massacres. The report, as we all know, was never published. An alternative report, Breaking the Silence, which was prepared by the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace, as well as the Legal Resources Foundation, was produced. The report stated that there were more than 20,000 civilians killed, tortured by security forces during the operation, and evidence of mass graves, even now, were discovered in addition to the location of mine shafts where bodies had been deposited. No action to date. At a meeting in London on 18th November 1985, Amnesty International submitted an aid memoir to the Minister of Home Affairs at the time, Enos Nkala, which outlined various ways in which the allegations of torture in Matabeleland could be investigated. We suggested, among others, an invitation to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture to conduct a thorough evaluation of the prevalent allegations of torture. In January 1986, Amnesty International sent the government a detailed memorandum that called for an investigation into reports of torture, including 21 detailed cases of torture in Bulawayo or elsewhere in Matabeleland. In February 1986, we published another report calling for an investigation into the killing of school teacher Luke Khumalo and his wife, who were killed in an attack, unexplained. Now, I'm talking about these examples among many to show the road we have walked on Zimbabwe. But as you have heard from the previous speakers, there is still no accountability and the impunity continues. And Amnesty continues to document just like others, and to also publish just like others. Right now, there needs to be a new demand for criminal sanctions. What we've documented over the years on Zimbabwe could be classified as crimes against humanity, and Musa and Tony talked about it. And just not to assume that everyone understands what crimes against humanity are. These are acts that are purposely committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilians in time of war or in peace. So I'm saying this just to emphasize that these are committed as a part of widespread or systematic attack. The Kukurakundi Massacres and many others we still document to date fall squarely within that arena. They are not isolated incidents, but are part of either a government policy or a widespread practice of atrocities tolerated or condoned by a government, by the government of Zimbabwe. So things such as kidnappings, which Musa, I think, alluded to, enforced disappearances, torture, for example, may reach the threshold of crimes against humanity if they are widespread and systematic. In our own estimation as Amnesty, they are widespread and they are systematic. So what has happened in the past, of course, we know that crimes against humanity have been prosecuted by various courts, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, for example, the International Criminal Tribunal where I worked for some time in Rwanda. And now we're talking about the International Criminal Court, as well as in domestic prosecutions and other hybrid sort of courts. Now, even though crimes against humanity are not codified in an international convention, there's currently an international effort to establish such a treaty led by the Crimes Against Humanity Initiative. So the crimes against humanity has the concept of crimes against humanity has really developed through the evolution of customary international law. And this last point about customary international law is important because it's universal in its reach. So I have heard many people, and many times people talking about referring individuals from Zimbabwe to the ICC, because in many instances, the perpetrators are known. So it's not a secret, they are known. And as we have heard, Zimbabwe is not a member of the Rome Statute. And ordinarily, in order for the ICC to prosecute a country, must be a member by having ratified the Rome Statute, or indeed, if not a member, they must accept its jurisdiction. However, technically, the ICC has global jurisdiction because even if a country isn't a party, it would be compelled to cooperate with the court if the particular case is referred by the UN Security Council. And so I now want to go to what the options are in addition to what my colleagues have already spoken about. And the first, and in no particular order whatsoever, is building an international coalition to advocate that the UN Security Council refers some of these crimes to the ICC. And I'm suggesting this route because there has been a lot of advocacy at sub-regional, regional, and other international bodies such as the AU, SADC. We've just heard from Musa how the SADC tribunal was killed by Zimbabwe. The African Commission, which continues to do a stellar job in just bringing out some of these things. And I'm glad that the AU is now talking a little bit more about what is happening in Zimbabwe. So there's a lot of documentation, as I said earlier, on atrocities committed in Zimbabwe. But there's something to be said about people being made an example at fora like the ICC. the shame, such as we see now with the referral to the ICC of the former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, is a case in point. Of course, there are limitations to using this route because the jurisdiction of the ICC only applies to crimes committed after 1 July 2002, when the Rome Statute entered into force. So this would still leave out atrocities committed in the 80s and 90s, but we know that there are so many other atrocities that have been committed since the statute came into effect. The second is, and Musa mentioned this, is getting solidarity. I like to talk about regional and international solidarity. Musa spoke about national action. So in addition to that, I think that we need to build that coalition of people regionally and internationally. And I think that there is still appetite for that, to really bring to bear issues that are happening in Zimbabwe. Some of these processes may look long and arduous, but I think there's something to still be said about international processes. Right now, I know that Malawi has been elected, as we all know, or may know, has been elected to be a member of the Human Rights Council. What message are we as civil society taking to Malawi? We have an opportunity now with this new president. We hope that it won't be squandered, but how can we use that? Sometimes it's the small countries that will surprise you and actually bring certain topics to the fore. So what can we do there? I'm sure there's lots that can be done because there are some countries that are receptive. So how can we organize ourselves around getting Malawi to play an important role while they're still on the Human Rights Council for the next 3 years? And then lastly, the conversations such as the one we're having are very important. How do we, because, you know, sometimes we seem to think that, well, we're just talking and talking, but actually talking does lead somewhere eventually. How do we build on these conversations such as this one and create a noisy coalition around countries such as South Africa? South Africa is a regional giant, even though now I don't think that South Africa has been playing the role that it should be playing. I do think that South Africa is still a country that feels a little bit embarrassed by international pressure. So how can we work around, how can we use that, how can we leverage that to really be noisy about the role that South Africa can play to support some of the initiatives regionally and internationally. So I'll end there, and I hope there'll be time for questions later. Thank you.
Excellent, 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 Mulea. Thank you very much indeed. And the threat implicit in your presentation should act as a deterrent if we proceed. And thank you for acknowledging us as part of the conversation towards a noisy coalition around the neighborhood and including Malawi. As I said earlier in my introduction, there's no doubt that the media and such conversations have helped to provoke the region into some kind of awareness on Zimbabwe, such as been shown by the South African visits to Zimbabwe. We'd hope that it becomes more multilateral and that the AU should not just stop by making statements, but also show some teeth. Let me now turn to the discussions. I'll begin with Lisa.
Thank you. I hope you're hearing me. Yes, well, as a discussant, first I will raise some themes that I've been hearing in the conversations, and then I'll speak a little bit about the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Survivors, if you will. Some of the themes that I'm really hearing clearly come through are this about, you know, breaking the cycles of violence that we're seeing happening. It's about documentation, and we know there's a lot of documentation going on, but I'm hearing some really interesting pieces about how to improve that documentation, how to enhance it, and use this vehicle of citizen agency in our documentation. And I would actually even talk about the work of the IRCT in knowing exactly what kind of documentation is necessary in order to document that torture has happened. What are the particular procedures you have to follow? How do you document it? Where do you bring it? So there's definitely a convergence of ideas there. I'm also hearing a very interesting commentary about pressure, right? So using peer pressure. And I think, Maleo, it was a really interesting piece you brought forward about Malawi. And we have an African nation there that could potentially be a vehicle for some, interesting pressure points. I would also point out Ghana, because as the nations who are involved in looking at the Torture Convention and the Convention Against Torture, Ghana is one of the 5-6 countries, together with Denmark, who are actually part of the like-minded countries who work in particular on getting more and more states to sign up and ratify. So I would invite the conversation about what about using Ghana as, a pressure point, particularly with respect to Zimbabwe potentially. The last one that I think is really interesting is this whole idea about, the noisy coalition. So exactly conversations like this combined with additional documentation and getting more momentum behind what's going on. And this idea about being noisy, about bringing our voice to bear with documentation. So those were just some themes I was hearing as a discussant. Ibo, back to you, but back to IRCT just for a brief moment, if you will. So the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims has always been looking at Zimbabwe and working on the case of Zimbabwe. Tony Reeler was a co-founder of the organization, and the counseling services unit has been instrumental in helping this global movement of organizations who work to make sure that torture survivors have a right to rehabilitation and that we work to eradicate torture. I'm really happy to be part of the discussions today to kind of give back. So from our perspective, in RCT, the most important thing is signing up to international human rights treaties. Even though there's a feeling of impunity, the commitment that has been made, and if you look back to 2016, where the government of Zimbabwe actually committed at the Universal Periodic Review to ratifying the Convention Against Torture, that commitment has to be returned to. We have to bring that back into play. We have to, I suggest, talk about that, because this clear commitment to using the international human rights treaties would be also a commitment and a statement to Zimbabweans who are fighting for this, and to the international community to end torture. Why to do this? Because this commitment would open the door to even more international support and technical assistance. As you said yourself, Ibo, there are some like-minded people within society. There are people who are denouncing this violence. There are some good people within the system who want to be working in a different way. So by opening a bit of a door there could be some more technical assistance and support coming in from organizations like ourselves, from the International Forensic Experts Group, who would be able to provide additional assistance. And why to do this? Because we can also see in many other countries around the world and in this region that signing up to the Universal Convention Against Torture and the OPCAT has also initiated global improvements in these countries. We understand this, it's primarily a system of impunity at this time, but the international treaty bodies are the system we have. So we are still speaking for an RCT that states step up to this. We have expertise in our organization for helping on the right to rehabilitation. We've also developed standards within the field of the right to rehabilitation. And at this point, our emphasis in our organization is looking at how are individuals actually enjoying, if at all, the right to rehabilitation. I would say in Zimbabwe, they're not enjoying it at all, aside from the phenomenal work that's being done by the civil society organizations. But it is the right of this, it is the responsibility of the state to be doing this. So the NGOs who are doing it now are filling a gap. It's important, though, to state that, as I mentioned before, along with the Danish government, the Ghanaian government is part of those leading the fight in the international community for the torture conventions and signatories and ratification. So again, we would appeal and bring into play, just as Amnesty did, what about African nations? Where are they and where's the leadership here? And could Ghana be applying some peer pressure to the situation or to the government of Zimbabwe? Finally, I would say that with respect to ensuring justice, and again, back to the work that IRCT has been doing across the world, we have a significant group of international forensic experts who are available to support in principled cases with gathering the relevant data and documentation, taking health data, analyzing it with through a legal lens, and being able to bring that to court. They're also available to provide training to human rights defenders to document in the correct way. And I know I was hearing from Malaya, there's a lot of this already going on. But again, just to reemphasize, we are there to help. We have an expertise that's worldwide, and whatever we can do, we would be more than willing to, and have been doing for years, but it's just reiterating that support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much indeed. Paul Graham.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much to the speakers. I thought the papers were really important and significant, and I want to thank everyone for organizing this forum. In a situation which is as dire as the one we are presently facing, having this type of internationally accessible forum which gives visibility to activists and humanizes victims and tells their stories, and helps to reestablish Zimbabwe as a cause célèbre is critical, because the world is a noisy place at the moment. It's not just the coalitions that are noisy. And there are many, many people clamoring for attention, and many struggles which are gaining that attention. And so our ability to raise the profile of the Zimbabwe case is quite critical. I want to make a few prepared remarks, very brief, and then reflect a little bit on what people have said. So without civil liberties, which are essentially undermined and destroyed presently in Zimbabwe, claiming political rights is extremely costly, as people know. And without political and civil rights, attaining social and economic rights for all people, as opposed for a privileged few, is almost impossible. And Zimbabwe remains an unfree country. The Freedom House scores, of which there will be a new iteration early in the new year, have Zimbabwe in the category of partly free countries. I want to come back to that if I have time. But the one thing that's very clear is that civil liberties are extremely poorly scored. Political rights is what tips people over the edge. And I think the assumption that many analysts make is that electoral democracy somehow makes a country slightly more free. I personally differ on that, and so there's no evidence that either Zimbabwe's incumbent government, or indeed the several neighboring governments, or SADC, are really willing or able to change the levels of freedom inside Zimbabwe at the moment, despite the more recent statements. We've got a long way to go before words become actions of any sort. And human rights defenders are being given support in Zimbabwe, both by domestic human rights groups and international human rights groups. But this is the support that field hospitals provide on the side of a battlefield, rather than support that substantially changes the power relations inside the country. And while the international community is divided, as I believe it is presently, with the conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean, the disasters in so-called Western democracies, and the difficulties that people are having in the East and in Latin America. And while the remnants of political society inside Zimbabwe seem to be intent rather on trying to reclaim past glories than confront the present realities, it's very hard actually to see what must be done. But of course, as the saying goes, we cannot go on, we must go on. And the one thing about Zimbabwe is that civil society has never capitulated. Despite what we heard from Musa, civil society, Zimbabweans inside and outside Zimbabwe have never given in to despair. And you've talked about the documentation. And now I just want to reflect very briefly on some of these comments. The assumption with human rights documentation is it will have some retrospective ability to deal with impunity. It might have some disincentive on present human rights abuse if people know that they are being watched. And they take that watching seriously because they know to whom the watchers are reporting. And it might have some validity in terms of popularizing, as you are doing today, the struggles that people are facing and the manner in which they are being victimized, and the difficulty that that causes for anyone trying to assert their rights. Because one of the things about Zimbabwe is that people think of it as at least a somewhat democratic state in which the present government aspires to democracy in the day and autocracy in the dark. And the fact that people visibly talk about their struggles, they go to court, they achieve civil remedies occasionally, people study Zimbabwe, suggests to the outside world that actually it's not as bad as we all know it is. Somehow we have to change this attitude and approach. And it's clear that the message is not entirely getting through the reports alone. That brings me to Mulea's suggestion that there's a coalition that starts to be more focused. Maybe we need to think of fewer things and derive the international mandate from Zimbabwe voices who have clear and communicated objectives to those of us acting in solidarity outside. There have been times when that has not always been the case, and there have been disparate voices about what can and should be done. I hope that that can change. Mulewa also mentioned Malawi. You'll remember that we have a case in Africa of Gambia taking up the struggles of the Rohingya people and succeeding in putting that case more firmly on the international stage. I think there may well be something to be said for taking Malawi more seriously as an ally. and relying less heavily on South Africa, which has, to be honest, its own problems, and which is increasingly parochial. And I suspect with the civil war inside the ANC is going to continue to be parochial for some time to come. I hope that people heard Musa talking about citizen agency. As I've reflected on Zimbabwe recently and on the demands in the international human rights world and on the causes that gain attention, it's been very hard to overlook the citizens of Belarus. Now, all countries are different. The manner in which violence manifests in Zimbabwe is so well documented by Tony. And we know how damaged it has been to the country and to individuals. But there's no doubt that the international community will begin to see Zimbabwe as a fundamental challenge to human rights globally, as agency is exercised within the country itself. Thanks so much, Ibu, and the panelists for your work and your presentations.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that very solid advice, obviously based on years of experience. We are more focusing on the idea of this coalition, Mulea's term, coalition, noise coalition. Unfortunately, Paul, we can't avoid South Africa. First of all, as you know, we have 3 million of our citizens there, Zimbabweans, not to mention those of other countries in the region. And it is the powerhouse, so to speak. And the international community in particular tend to look at South Africa as the reference point of anything that happens in the region. Yes, we hear you. Let's see what happens with Malawi. Sipo, my dear Sydney.
Thank you so much, Ivo. There's very little that hasn't been said. So I will try to really just cover aspects that maybe reinforce crucial aspects that have been raised, but also cover just a few aspects that have not yet been covered. Thank you so much, Tony, for walking us through not even a panoramic or picturesque view of the history of atrocity in our country. It's actually a sordid walk through, it's not even through a park, it's through a chamber of horrors that you walked us through there. And I want to appreciate your very clear understanding of the history of violence in our country and its source in impunity, inbuilt impunity, in the way in which the state interacts with citizens. A state pre-independence that was predisposed to violence and then put in place legal insulation to avoid accountability for its violence against citizens. The Indemnity and Compensation Act by the Rhodesian regime and the amnesties that followed by Lord Solms and then subsequently throughout post-independent history, it is very clear that the state in Zimbabwe and its predecessor fashioned a modus operandi of violent engagement with its citizens, and then fashioned a system of protection of itself for what it clearly understood and knew were criminal acts by legalizing those criminal acts post facto or preemptively by creating these amnesty provisions in the laws. And then, of course, that is just the legal aspect, but this was very enthusiastically accompanied by practice where none of the people who in the state who committed crimes would ever face accountability. They would be allowed to go scot-free. This is where we are 40 years after independence. This is exactly what has been happening. The perpetrators, they feel that they walk on water like Jesus did. They can literally get away with anything because they have got away with anything and everything. So that's the perspective, that's the history. But in truth, they can't get away with everything. It's impossible that anybody can get away with everything. You can only get away with everything if you control the power and the ability of those that hold you accountable. That's all. You can only get away with anything and everything within a limited set of circumstances. So my intervention is in three parts. So I'm going to talk about the crimes, and then I'm going to talk about criminal responsibility, and then I'm going to talk about accountability. So there is absolutely no doubt that the abuses that we have seen in post-independent Zimbabwe are crimes under our law. They are criminal acts. They are not something that somebody does that is not covered by the law. As a result, they must invite criminal consequences. And in our law, criminal consequences for a crime is an arrest and a prosecution, and if found guilty, a conviction and imprisonment or a sentence. So every crime that is committed in society must be visited by those consequences. Every crime that has been committed in Zimbabwe is due to be visited by those consequences. So we must be under no illusion about the acts, about the conduct of state officials, ruling party officials, or functionaries that may neither be state or ruling party who have committed crimes. And I will go on here to say that all the acts that have been described over time, including by my brother, Kika, constitute crimes under our national law, the revised criminal code and its predecessor, the criminal law, which was the common criminal law in Zimbabwe. It is a crime to beat somebody in Zimbabwe. It's the criminal conduct is called assault, and it has different gradations. If it is severe, it is called with assault to do grievous bodily harm. And if the assault results in a death, it can be called murder. We have those crimes in our statute books. There are other crimes that have been committed, which are also crimes in our criminal law. So abductions in our criminal law classically are called kidnappings. These are crimes under our law. If you take somebody against their will and you hold them against their will, you commit the crime of kidnapping. And that crime, the sentence ranges in our statute books from a period of imprisonment to the death penalty. I had the privilege of dealing with an abduction case many years ago. I don't have the time to share it. And a former advocate, the late advocate Anderson, we engaged him as counsel, and he had the inauspicious responsibility of telling my clients, who were shocked to hear him say, well, you know, the penalty for the crime you're accused of ranges from a prison sentence to the death penalty. My clients almost fell off their chairs. They had not even quite understood that what they had done could even amount to the death penalty. There are many other crimes. Crimes against women, rape is a crime in our law. I'm talking about our domestic law. And of course, murder is a crime in our law. Our law does not recognize the crime of mass murder, but I'll talk about those crimes under international law. So it is quite clear and incontrovertible that the acts and the abuses we are describing that have gone on in Zimbabwe and that are going on in Zimbabwe right now are crimes. And therefore, as crimes, they require criminal legal consequence. It's important for perpetrators to know that they have committed, are committing and or are committing crimes. The second part is that they are not just crimes under criminal law, Zimbabwean criminal law, they're crimes under international law. Mulea has described crimes against humanity. And all the crimes that we see in Zimbabwe fall into a range of 3 categories of international crimes. The first, torture. Torture is an international crime. The Convention Against Torture is now customary international law. Whether or not you are a party to the Torture Convention, you are still bound by it. And we must remember that the Commission of International International Crimes attracts universal jurisdiction, especially if those crimes are also crimes under customary international law. I hear a lot of excitement coming from lawyers for the ruling party, lawyers that advise these perpetrators, we are not a party to the International Criminal Court. I say, yeah, keep thinking that. Keep committing crimes, keep committing torture, keep committing crimes against humanity. It does not matter whether you're a party to it or not. Bashir was not a party to it, but he's going to the International Criminal Court. He's going there. He refused to sign, just like Mugabe. He refused to be a party to the International Criminal Court. But the minute you commit an international crime, regardless of where you're committed, you have committed an international crime. And you will remain liable until the law catches up with you. And it will at some point. So it's very important that perpetrators know this. They must not fool themselves. They must not lie to themselves. The only reason why they are not being held to account is because they are clinging on to power right now. And they, of course, continue clinging to power. But we know what happens. The more you use power, the more you lose it. You will lose power at some point. Just like Mugabe lost power. Who would have thought Mugabe would ever lose power? So the point for me is this. There is still time to stop committing crimes. It is possible to stop committing crimes. You don't have to continue committing crimes. Now, when it comes to who is accountable, we know, I think it was Tony who said that the arguments have been, well, it was my brother Musa actually who said, the arguments have been, we are not committing these crimes, this is a third force, and then these are fake abductions. But let us remember one more thing that's so important. Associated with the notion of international crimes is the notion of criminal responsibility. What does that mean? Criminal responsibility is the level of perpetration of a crime. It is the responsibility of perpetrators of a crime. It is the notion that determines who is held accountable and responsible for a crime. There's two types of responsibility under international law for crimes. The first is individual responsibility, individual criminal responsibility, and that includes the responsibility of direct perpetrators of crime. So the person who goes out, the ferret member who goes out and knocks down a door and drags out an activist and goes and tortures him is directly and individually criminally responsible for that crime. A person who aids and abets a crime is individually responsible for that crime. What is to aid and abet? To provide a car. Impala Rentals, for example, is directly and criminally responsible for participating in the abduction of Tawanda Mchaiwa. They don't need to have been there. They provided the vehicle. You are also criminally responsible if you provide the finance. You are criminally responsible if you provide the planning, if you provide the logistical support. You are criminally responsible if you just stand outside and watch as a guard. So it is very clear that criminal responsibility covers anybody and everybody who is involved in the perpetration, the aiding, the support, any logistical, and even any planning and designing of a crime. That is the first thing. It also includes anybody who orders the commission of a crime. So if you order, even if you're not present at the time, even if you're not there, if you say, please go and do X, Y, Z, you are individually criminally responsible for that crime. There is another level of responsibility, which is the most dangerous for our political and military leaders, and I don't know why they don't even see this. It is called command responsibility or superior responsibility. Command responsibility is the responsibility of any person in command for the crimes of their subordinate. So a subordinate can go and commit a crime. You don't even need to be there. You can be held criminally responsible if you failed to do a number of things. Firstly, if you fail to prevent the commission of a crime. And secondly, if you fail to prosecute and punish that crime. Mugabe, clear candidate for criminal responsibility. He died without even facing his justice, because even if he was to argue, well, we've got enough evidence that Mugabe actually sent out the Kukurakundi. It was a widespread and systematic attack, the role of the state, organizing the brigade, training it, equipping it. So what Mulea talked about earlier, the definition of a crime against humanity is met by many of the crimes we see. So a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population. That's what we see all the time. Widespread and systematic attacks, widespread and systematic abductions, widespread and systematic torture, widespread systematic beatings of civilians. It's widespread, it's systematic, it requires the mobilization of significant state resources, it requires the order, it requires the police, it requires everybody out there. These are crimes against humanity. And let us assume, for example, that as many people want to argue that Kukurakundi is so long ago, the Rome Statute doesn't apply, all the crimes that have happened more recently are covered. They are covered by international law and international justice. So the last point for me is this: the failure to punish a crime once you are aware as a commander or a superior or a political leader. Mind you, command responsibility is not restricted only to military leaders. It is also inclusive of political leaders. The Prime Minister of Rwanda was convicted under superior responsibility. The mayor, Akayesu, was convicted. A mayor. General Krstić in Bosnia, he was a Croat, I think, you can correct Mulea. General Krstić was convicted of rape as a crime against humanity by his soldiers. He was never even near the area where the rapes were committed. He was convicted for rape by his soldiers. He was not even there. He was not even there. So I'm saying this, and I'm imploring the political and military leaders, stop your subordinates from committing the crimes, because you are going to go down for them. Stop them. I'm assuming you're not ordering those crimes. If you are, you will go down for them as for individual criminal responsibility. But if you are not, you're not doing yourself a favor by not stopping them. If you're a commander of the army, any military person who commits a crime which is then brought to your attention and you fail to prevent or to punish that person, you are liable. It doesn't matter that you didn't do it. It's not enough for you to say, no, but I didn't do it. I was sitting in my house. I didn't order this crime. It does not work like that. You are liable criminally for any subordinate. So if you want to distance yourself from the crime, hold any perpetrator accountable, arrest them, prosecute them, show that you are not part of it. So that's my last point is accountability. I'm not going to say much more because I think Mulea talked about this. The allegation and the argument that because Zimbabwe is not a part of the ICC, it is not possible to hold any perpetrator accountable is a fallacy. It is a complete and utter fallacy. I've already mentioned the case of Bashir. It does not matter that you are not a party to the ICC. And mind you, even if you are not a party to the ICC, Zimbabweans still hold the prerogative of holding you accountable at some point in time. And mind you, universal jurisdiction allows for you to be arrested elsewhere. And there are some countries that are very pleased and eager to exercise it. It's complicated. There's issues around head of state immunity, but we all know what the decisions on that have been. There is no head of state immunity anymore for crimes against humanity. That is why Bashir had to run like a fox from South Africa, because South Africa was obligated to arrest him. He was the head of state, if you remember. He was here at an AU summit. There is no immunity, head of state immunity now. Customary law has removed it, especially for international crimes. So my last point is simply that there are consequences. There may not be consequences in the spaces you control, simply because you control those places. But there are consequences for international crimes. What can we do now? We can stop committing the crimes, and you can, like de Klerk did. De Klerk got away with murder. He got away with crimes against humanity. That's what he did. You can negotiate your way out. You can negotiate a process that allows the country to transition from this period of bloodletting and violence into a period of peace, where as part of your negotiation, you negotiate with the people of Zimbabwe to let you go for your crimes. You have to ask the people of Zimbabwe to let you go for your crimes, because the crimes have not gone away and they will not go away. I personally believe that the people of Zimbabwe may be willing to have that conversation. I don't think they should, but I believe they may be willing. The people of South Africa were willing to have that conversation. In El Salvador, they had those conversations. In Chile and Argentina, they had similar conversations. That's called transitional justice. I don't particularly like it because I don't like people to get away with murder, but sometimes a political transition does require trade-offs. And this is the time. And I say this even as a lawyer who prefers more than anything else accountability under international law. I want to see people face justice for what they have done, but the window is closing. As these perpetrators believe they are invincible, I'm saying the window is closing. Bashir never saw how much the window had closed until it was too late. Neither did our brother leader Gaddafi. Neither did our brother Keita in Mali. But the window closes and shuts so quickly before you know it. Next thing, Zimbabweans are hauling you through the courts and the legal process, or they are just taking you and handing you over to the criminal court and saying, please deal with this person. We don't even want them here. And I'm saying you still have control over the narrative. You have control over the political process. Fashion a transition that allows the country to move from this terrible, terrible, bloody period to a process where you step away, but you still step away and you negotiate for your freedom, because it's not guaranteed. It's never guaranteed when you commit crimes. Thank you so much.
Sipo, Sydney, was brutal. Brutal. I hope this can be, Tony, this must be documented, this entire conversation, and published. It's very important. I think you have answered the question, what is to be done now? Saying it as you have, it gives a poignant message, a real message, a strong message. Hands, please. Eleanor, you ready? People may put up their hands or begin with Eleanor, then there's Jana, Ngube.
Okay.
Put
Thank
up
you.
your hands, we'll note you down. Eleanor, please.
Okay, thank you to Sipo and all the people speaking after me. It's a bit of a tall order to speak after Sipo. He really riles up people's emotions. You know, a lot has been said that I agree with totally. The international remedies, what must be done in the region. I think Sipo's points are really important. So I'm not going to, I'll try not to repeat anything anyone has said. I just want to pick up on the issue of that was raised about citizen agency, because I truly believe that a lot of what happens is not just the regime to be blamed, but also a citizen apathy. You know, the saying that bad things happen when good men do nothing. And I think there's a lot of apathy and almost an acceptance of some of these things. When I remember coming back from Senegal after going to study there, when my boss, Ibo Mandaza, forced me to suffer 9 months in West Africa. And I came back and an aunt was telling me about what happened while I was away. And she said, you know, so-and-so committed suicide. And this woman worked for the army. She says she committed suicide. She drank that acid, you know, the one that the army uses to make people disappear. And the way this thing was said, it was like, you know, there was no shock and horror that the army has acid that makes people disappear. It was an acceptance. And I think there's a large extent of acceptance and there's a lot of citizen apathy. And I agree with everything that must be done on the legal front, the international remedies, but I think there have to be ways to make citizens more conscious. We've seen what has happened in the US, the killing of George Floyd, which has really brought on a sea change in American policy and politics, and has fueled the Black Lives Movement. And I think we need to have strategies to make citizens more conscious. And I think it's the way we tell stories and present things. The way things have been presented today, very articulately and are good for human rights activists and specialist communities. But I think when we talk to citizens, we must present stories and we must give names of people. And the criticism I have of the human rights, well, both of civil society and Zimbabwean political movements, is that we've not hammered on these stories. We've not hammered. People respond to individuals. I think, you know, the ANC used Mandela as a name because, and it was a good move because people respond to someone and relate to someone. If you just give numbers and say 20, 30, 40 were abducted over the last while, for ordinary people, that doesn't have such an impact. And I just want to, I also feel it's just important to mention people's names when we do this. So, you know, I want to mention Rashiwe Guja, who disappeared in 1990, Edson Sitole, 1975, with his secretary, Miriam Mplanga, never found again. 1989, Captain Edward Nlea. early 1990s, Marceline Zumbura. 2000, Patrick Nabanga, polling agent in the June 2000 parliamentary elections. Kane Nkala, 2001. Abigail Chiroto, 2008. Tondera Indira, 2008. Justina Mukoko, 2008. And I certainly believe that Justina's life was saved by immediate and strong international protest. And along with Justina were a number, about 70 MDC activists, including a 2-year-old, Nigel Mutemagau, and his mother was kidnapped with his mother, Violet, and his father, Colin Mutemagau. And it also included a 70-year-old activist. Then February 2012, Paul Chizuze vanished. 9th of March, and I always remember on my birthday, Itai Zamara, who disappeared. Then Samantha Correa, more recently Peter Magombe, and then the young women from the MDC, Joanna, and I just forget the others at the moment. It's really important to personalize this and put, and I want to make a suggestion that you have International Day of Victims of Enforced Disappearances, which was declared by the UN on 21st December by its resolution 65209. And the same resolution welcomed the adoption of the Convention of the Protection of Persons from Enforced Disappearances. And I really believe that on this day, Zimbabweans should use it as an advocacy and remind people of all these names. We're not just talking about abstractions, we're talking about names of people, and we have to repeat these stories and let people hear the stories. On the days of the International Day of Torture commemorations, you have people in Kosovo repeating their stories, people in Uruguay repeating their stories. I think many of you may remember the protest of the women in Chile, the protest of the mothers against enforced disappearances that went on for years and years. And I think these stories of enforced disappearances need to be repeated, and there needs to be a popular, an effort. Well, I would say it's a propaganda effort to counter the propaganda of the state. We need a counter narrative to this story of the very pernicious argument that the state uses, that these abductions were, that people abduct themselves. And we can't deny that that has some success and a considerable demobilizing effect on many people. And we have to counter these narratives. And you know, we've got the tool, we've got the social media tools that we didn't have before, that even if the regime controls the airwaves, they don't control Twitter, they don't control WhatsApp, they don't control Facebook. And we must use these to actually hammer these message home in the same way that the regime hammers the message of sanctions. And they do it constantly, and they've done it with some success in the region. So we really need to do this. I think that if we also don't reach ordinary people and we don't reach the populace of the Zimbabweans, I'm afraid that the Zimbabwean population has, under colonialism, then under ZANU-PF, actually sees some of these things as normal and doesn't respond. I see in South Africa a far different level of response. You know, if the South African government, not to say that it doesn't do things, I mean, people talk about Marikana, of course, and other abuses, but it's much more difficult. The cost is much higher for the state to abduct individuals or to kill them. And I think that we need to drive the cost higher. For example, this Impala car sales, I really can't understand why there hasn't been a mass boycott campaign against them. Because, you know, when you ask people for solidarity, it's easy if you ask them for one thing. If you say, just do this thing, just let's boycott this Impala, let's find out, let's lobby with, if it's in South Africa, with whatever license registration they have, let's work to get it withdrawn. If you ask people to do one simple thing, our lesson with all the advocacy that we did in Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition between 2003 and 2009, our most successful advocacy was around Justina Mokoko's abduction, where we saw people who hadn't been mobilized before come up because there was a name and a person and a face. And people rallied behind, and I genuinely believe that saved Justina's life. And the fact that of actually saying there is this person, and it had a knock-on effect that the other people who were abducted were also saved. I think the stories, we just drop them. For example, Nigel Mutemakau. Nigel was 2 years old. And I asked myself, where is Nigel now? You know, what has happened to Nigel? Surely this is the things that we should be bringing up year after year. You know, we just let things drop. We have Operation Muramba China. And the same kind of operation has been going in. We just let that drop. We don't remind this regime. We don't remind the region. This is what this regime did, and this is what it is continuing to do. So I would say on the propaganda side, we just need a strong, powerful narrative where we will hammer and hammer and hammer on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks. Thanks very much. And thanks again for bringing the subject up. And I'm sure you feel that the panel has acquitted themselves enormously today, far beyond my expectations. I will take one or two hands because we're out of time. Any hands there? Jana, Ngube, are you there? Okay. So I'll have to go back to Lisa to do your summary and conclusion, followed by program, and then Sipo again, and then Mulea, Musa, and then last but not least, Tony, in that order.
Thank you, Ibo. Yeah, a really powerful conversation tonight. I can only condone and support the ideas of international accountability, making sure we use the international tools, the international human rights bodies and treaties, refer to them. Crimes have been committed, document these crimes have been committed, continue to claim the crime that's been committed and document it and prove that case. And I think community activism is an incredibly powerful tool, and the tools of documentation are at our hands. So knowing what to document, knowing where to bring that documentation, to bring the individual documentation combined with the individual stories is obviously a tool that is successful. And I really appreciate, Eleanor, your words and your call to strongly hammer repeatedly, incessantly, consistently on the abuses, call them out, and pursue justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Paul?
Thanks to everybody for this event. I do hope that there will be a push for an international campaign to get the attention of international courts. Let's not leave that too long. I also just want to remind everybody that advocacy for Zimbabwe in the international community may sometimes fall on deaf ears, even with elected governments or states that have theoretically human rights components to their foreign affairs. But that does not stop you from talking to citizens in those states more forcefully. And I think Eleanor identified some of the ways in which you can begin to build a new alliance, because I think there were previous alliances of citizens in solidarity with Zimbabwe, but I think new ones are needed. And the less confusion there is about what is going on inside Zimbabwe, and the less confusion there is between different political and civil society actors in Zimbabwe, the clearer the messages are about what is happening and what needs to be done, the more likely it is that those citizen alliances in solidarity with Zimbabwe will be reestablished. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thank you immensely. Sydney.
Thank you very much, Ibu. For me, in closing, I have a message, firstly to Zimbabweans. And my message to Zimbabweans is do not despair. Justice is coming. It will come. It always comes. And is replete with examples. 1990, all with the help of the African Union. And Abductions and Kabuga, who was the financier. Hello, I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you now, I can hear you.
Okay, my internet seemed unstable. So Felicien Kabuga, the Rwandese financer of the genocide, escaped justice and he was hiding and running all over the world. And he was apprehended this year and is now been referred to the tribunal for residual mechanisms. He's now facing justice for his crimes he committed in 1990. This is 26 years later. Bruno Day, 93-year-old SS guard, was convicted this year for crimes he committed in 1944. He was a Nazi SS guard, 93 years old. He was convicted of those crimes. So my message to Zimbabweans, do not despair. The only thing that will save these perpetrators is death like Mugabe. That's all. That's the only salvation from anybody who commits a crime anywhere in the world. My message to perpetrators of crimes and to some of the political actors who happen to be political and military actors, stop it. Just stop the crimes. Negotiate. Negotiate with the victims of your crimes. Talk to them, negotiate a way out. Because as long as these crimes have been committed, they will remain like an albatross on your neck. But you have a chance to negotiate. So it is not Zimbabweans who must negotiate for their freedom from perpetrators. No, no. It is perpetrators who must negotiate for their freedom from Zimbabweans. The only people who are guilty of crimes who deserve to be locked up are those people who have committed crimes. Zimbabweans will fight for their freedom. They won't negotiate for it. But perpetrators must negotiate. And when they do, this is my last message, let's all keep an open mind. Zimbabweans must keep an open mind. When perpetrators negotiate, Zimbabweans must keep an open mind. But that is not a free pass because the window will close. And the point to perpetrators is that negotiate when the window is still open. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sydney. Thank you very much. You've been brutally frontal today. Very good indeed. Mulea, your last words? Mulea?
Yeah. Okay, yes, I was still waiting to be unmuted. Right, yeah, thank you very much. So two things. The first one is just to follow on what Ma'am Eleanor said about people's stories. I think that's a very powerful message. And I will talk about a more recent or a fresh story, Itai Dzamara, for example. I think there was a lot of international mobilization around Itai Dzamara. But if that could be brought to bear locally as well, for citizens to actually take those stories inside Zimbabwe, I think that would really go a long way. The second one is exactly what Sipho has been talking about. The long arm of the law, it will still find you. You can't run away for customary international, from international crimes, because they are codified in customary international law. So let's keep the pressure going. Thanks.
Thanks, Mulea. Thanks very much. Musa? Musa is gone, eh? Let's have Tony. Also, if you can give us the closing remarks and the summary of our deliberations. So we've run out of time. Tony?
Thank you. It's been a very rich conversation, and I want to quickly start with an anecdote. In 1994, two families sat on the beach in Beira. We'd gone there after the liberation and the war had stopped. And we sat there on the beach, listening on the radio to the South African election. And we were deeply excited. We thought finally the continent is going to be free from north to south. And then, of course, there were all sorts of funny things happened with that South African election. At the same time, nearly 1 million people were chopped up, raped, and destroyed in Rwanda. And we only found that out when we came home, and slowly the story trickled through. And I remember watching on Zimbabwe television this absolutely heartrending story of a little girl running across a bridge all by herself. It evoked for me, who's an older person, the same picture of a little girl running, having been burnt by napalm in Vietnam. That incident and that time provoked the world into a notion about the responsibility to protect. It was the events that happened in the Balkans and Rwanda that said to people, you cannot stand by when bad things happen. And in 2005, people basically signed up to that. Now, what that proposed was a moral responsibility on people. And that moral responsibility, with all the reservations that all of us had, sits in front of Zimbabwe. And where will Zimbabwe go? We're rated one of the most fragile states in the whole world. And you know what happens with fragile states. They can really become very failed states, and very bad things happen. And we've had some very bad things happen recently, and they're increasing in a very, very alarming fashion. And one of the ways in which the responsibility to protect argues is this must be put where such a situation needs to be prevented to the UN. And Mulea raised this. She said there needs to be an international movement to say, intervene, take responsibility to protect the citizens of Zimbabwe. And not just from the gross human rights violations, but from an uncaring government that has increasingly shown little respect for the hardships that the citizens are facing. Hunger on a mass scale, collapsed services, all of these things, in a country in which the citizens have no trust in the government or the state or even political parties. That's what the Catholic Church said in its Sabbath, all the churches said in the Sabbath, the Catholic Church has repeated it recently. So the point is that we need this international responsibility. It has to come from somewhere, and I'm really pleased that IRCT and Amnesty will join with us, and we will find this international coalition to put it to people that the first step before accountability is prevention. First, do no harm. Primum non nocere. Stop the stuff that's going on. Exactly as Sifo said, this is urgent. And this is urgent in a region that is quietly and gently collapsing, with Mozambique likely to, or possibly to develop into civil war, and the region to become more and more unstable. And Zimbabwe is a serious point of that. We live with a broken government, a broken state that cannot deliver anything, and there is no way back except for political reform. And what they do in order to protect themselves, and, you know, I think Sifo put it bluntly and boldly, is they rely on coercion. And coercion has a cost. And Sifo has put it really bluntly. The cost doesn't go away. It stays with you forever. And this is the issue that we have to put to everybody. This is not a domestic problem only. It is a regional problem. It's an international problem. It's an international problem like the Yemen and everyone else. And the will in the world might be quite weak, but Zimbabwe, courtesy of Amnesty International, the IRCT, Human Rights Watch, all the organizations that have bravely documented and speak out all the time about an unacceptable end to 40 years of an independent country that should be stable, that should be prosperous, that should be leading the region in democracy. This is what we have to do. And I thank you all for your very rich presentations. And I do hope that this message goes out wider and broader. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks. And I'm sorry that Musa has had problems with his internet. But want to, again, I think Tony, to thank you again for putting together a fantastic panel of panelists and discussers. I think everyone prepared so well. Everything wove into the next. It's one of the most powerful statements on the subject. Something we'll savor, document, disseminate, and include in a publication very soon. I want to thank you all. We run out of time. There's no time for summary, but just to thank you all for fantastic presentation. And for those of you out there, I hope you have listened. For those in government offices, in Zimbabwe in particular, I hope you have taken note. Sipo's poignant, emotional statement refers, but it has such legal import that no one dare ignore that. But most of all, I think if the question was how to stop it, now we have started stopping it. Thank you again. And I wait for your suggestions as the next topic, as Eleanor has done so well to suggest this topic, about which we are really satisfied as the manner in which all of you have covered it. And thanks again to our newcomers, Lisa, Paul Graham. It was really nice having you in our conversation. And again, good night until we meet again.